getting ready to sing. Well, I will say this, if I wasn't fired up before I got here this morning, singing that we've already done would have done it for me. It just means a lot to me to be with brethren I've never met before. I do so much appreciate being asked to come out here. It's a joy to be in Indio. I've been in Indio before. I've never worshiped with you brethren here before, but I appreciate the invitation. It is, we've been told a lot of things, as Shannon just said, about Phil and Kim and Ben, about folks here, and we're looking forward to get to meet you, get to know you personally. I would take the time to tell you what all happened before we got here, but I only have a short time, and that would take 15 minutes of it, so I'm not going to do that. But needless to say, we are enjoying being here, and for no other reason, for the weather. There's a lot of bad weather in other parts of the country right now, but we got here, and so we're glad to be here. Never met Dave before. I enjoyed getting to hear him. Actually, Bob has preached in gospel meetings 2 times in other places where I've been, in Nacogdoches, Texas, and where we are now there in Mississippi. And I'm looking forward to getting to hear his last time. It'll be worthwhile as well. If you were to take a tour through Washington, D.C., very likely you would be taken to the largest library in the world. Of course, that's the famous Library of Congress. It takes up 3 massive buildings. It's said to contain over 130 million items. In the main reading room of the Library of Congress, there's a plaque on the wall. And the plaque reads, "What doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God?" Isn't that something? Doesn't surprise me that I don't know if that would be put there today, but back when it was, that would certainly be an appropriate way to try to capture what true religion is all about. When William G. Harding was being inaugurated as president back in 1921, he asked that they would use the Bible that George Washington had used, but he further requested that they would open that Bible to Micah 6 and 8. And that's the passage we're thinking about today. It certainly is one of the grandest texts in all the Bible. Almost everything I have read in trying to prepare for this, at some point the writer would say that this is perhaps one of the most outstanding statements made 27 centuries ago by God's prophet about what God really expects and wants from us. So it is the basis for all 3 of the lessons today. We've already, I don't think I'll take the time to read back through the first 8 verses, but just we'll be thinking about what Dave read to us a moment ago. This situation where God was really bringing, some verses say, a controversy or a complaint or an indictment against Israel. Both Samaria and Jerusalem, both Judah and Israel, were not faithful to God. And in this text, as we saw earlier, God is asking them, what have I done? Why should you not be faithful to me? And anticipates then their response, well, what do you want? The burnt offerings and the calves and the thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil. To give my firstborn, ironically, one of the contemporary kings, Ahaz, did something similar to that, whether it was to Jehovah God or not, but human sacrifice. And so then the response comes back that really God has told you. God doesn't take delight in all that, but he's told you, oh man, and here's our text. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Micah has distilled down into those 3 items that we're going to be talking about this morning. The justice, and the mercy or kindness, and the humility of man. It's really interesting, I think, that one of his contemporaries, Hosea, says something very similar to this. Look at Hosea 12 and 6, and you'll find Hosea saying this, observe kindness and justice, and wait for your God continually. And that also reminds me of what Jesus said. You remember in Matthew 23, that great passage where Jesus was really excoriating, this scathing rebuke against the hypocrites, the scribes and the Pharisees. And in verse 23, Jesus pointed out that they were so scrupulously, meticulously tithing of their little garden herbs, the mint, the anise, the cumin. And yet he said, you've omitted the weightier, the more important things of the law. You remember what those 3 were? You've omitted the weightier provision of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. So in this lesson this morning, I'm going to talk to you about loving kindness. Actually, the word is translated kindness in some translations, is rendered mercy in others. In fact, there's another word. This Hebrew word is very often translated by an interesting word, loving kindness. Loving kindness. And so we'll be using those terms back and forth. Kindness and loving kindness and mercy. We just had a lesson on justice, as Micah speaks of it there. And although justice and mercy are complementary to one another, I think there's a very important distinction that needs to be made between these two things. As Dave pointed out, justice carries with it the idea of equity and fairness, giving what is due and right. But actually mercy or kindness goes beyond that. And it gives that which is not always required by strict justice. Abraham Lincoln supposedly once said, "I've always found that mercy bears richer fruits than strict justice." And that's very true. There's justice, but then there is that which exceeds that justice, which is mercy. I think one of the best illustrations I've ever heard of this, perhaps you've heard this story before, but it's said that during the reign of Napoleon, the young man was caught stealing from the royal palace. In fact, he was caught twice. And after the second time, he was convicted and sentenced to die. And when his mother learned of this, she ran to the emperor and she threw herself before him and desperately pleading with him for mercy for her son, that his life be spared. And Napoleon's first response was, "Your son deserves justice, and justice means he will die." And to which his mother said, "But I don't ask for justice, Your Highness. I ask for mercy." And then Napoleon said, "But he doesn't deserve mercy." And she said, "If he deserved it, it would not be mercy." And suppose that touched Napoleon so much that he consented and spared her son. Justice and mercy. She wanted mercy. I think there's a similar idea for this, maybe not quite exactly the same, but you remember in Romans 5, where the Apostle Paul was trying to impress upon them, upon us, what a great thing is that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Remember how you introduced that thought there? Paul says that someone hardly die for a righteous man, yet peradventure for a good man someone even dare to die. I think we still have that same concept. Here's a righteous man who does what's just, what's righteous, and some might not, hardly would die for that man, but here's a man who goes beyond that. He's a good man. And I would say a good man who shows mercy and kindness. Some might die for him. And so that contrast between justice and mercy. Going back now to Micah 6, just like his contemporaries did, Isaiah and Hosea and others, Micah is pointing out earlier in the book that there was a desperate need for mercy and kindness. Among the many ills of the two nations was this ill treatment of their fellow men. Notice this quickly back in chapter 2. Micah says, "Woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil in their beds. When morning comes, they do it, for it is in the power of their hands. They covet fields, and they seize them. And houses, and they take them away. They rob a man in his house, and a man in his inheritance." If that's not bad enough, look at chapter 3. And think about mercy and kindness. And here's what Micah was confronting. He says, "They're tearing the skin from my people, and the flesh from their bones. They're eating my people's flesh. They're breaking their bones in pieces, and they're chopping them up like meat for the pan." Now that may be hyperbolic and figurative language, but it certainly graphically describes the lack of mercy in the culture and society that Micah was addressing. Before we consider how obviously Micah is telling us God requires of us justice and mercy and humility that Bob will talk about. But before we think about this mercy that we're to show, I think it will be helpful for us to take the time and go back and be impressed with one of the attributes of God. Just as we just noticed, the justice of God is His very nature, so is His mercy. The mercy of God. Have you ever noticed how much is said in the Old Testament? Praising and thanking God for being a merciful and kind and long-suffering God. It's throughout, but particularly in the book of Psalms, the book of praises, praising God for His marvelous attributes, constantly focuses upon how He has such a merciful spirit. Let me just cite a few of them to you. Psalm 36 and verse 7. "How excellent is thy loving kindness, O God! Therefore the children of men put their trust under the shadow of thy wings." We can be comforted and trust because of his long suffering or his mercy. When David found himself, you study the life of David, you know the terrible, as he was fleeing the wrath of this insane, jealous King Saul, constantly in jeopardy. And as David was speaking of that in Psalm 59, he said in verse 16, I will sing aloud of thy mercy in the morning, for thou hast been my defense and the refuge in the day of trouble. David could always turn to God and know he is a God of long suffering and mercy and compassion. One of my favorite passages is Psalm 103. My dad loved it and committed it to memory. And every time I read Psalm 103, I think about my father. But in two places in that psalm, that's the psalm, of course, that begins, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all of his benefits. And we get to verse 11. Now the psalm here focuses upon the mercy of God. Look verse 11. As the heaven is high above the earth, so great is his mercy to them that fear him. So sort of trying to describe it spatially, how vast it is. And then you drop to verse 17, and he comes and tries to describe it in terms of time. It says, the mercy of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting upon them that fear him. Very impressed. I see some of you with your Bibles open. You want to turn with me to Psalm 136. Now, I'm not going to read Psalm 136, but if you read it before, I'm sure you've noticed what I'm going to point out to you at this point. I'll just read a few of the verses. It has 26 verses. Psalm 136, 26 verses. Verse 1. Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for his good, his mercy endureth forever. Verse 2. Oh, give thanks unto God of the gods, for his mercy endureth forever. We just read that. Verse 3. Oh, give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his mercy endureth forever. Verse 4. To him alone doth great wonders, for his mercy endureth forever. And you just go around and to it. Every one of those 26 verses closes with, some versions would say, your loving kindness is everlasting. This version says, your mercy endures forever. The psalmist, I think, was trying to get the message across, perhaps as they use this even in their worship in the temple, to just think about it. Forever and ever, God is always continuously merciful. And how thankful we should be for that. Let me quickly go to one of the prophets and notice what Jeremiah said about this. In Jeremiah 9, what is it that impresses you? What people accomplish and what they can point to boast about? Look what Jeremiah says. Let not the wise man boast of his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast of his might. Let not the rich man boast of his riches. But let him who boasts, boast in this, that he understands and knows me. Of course, this isn't Jeremiah speaking, it's God speaking through the prophet. Boast that he understands and knows me. What about you? That I am the Lord who exercises loving kindness. Do we appreciate, as fully as we should, that God is a merciful God? And what we're thinking about Jeremiah, of course, you remember the weeping prophet. He lived a life where he suffered greatly. And we're going to talk about that, Lord willing, some more tomorrow evening. But Jeremiah lived to see the time which God allowed the Babylonians to come take Jerusalem. And he wrote a book lamenting the horrible consequences of their sins had finally come. But in that very book of lamentation, Jeremiah thinks back. Look at it here in Lamentation 3. It says, this I recall to mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindness indeed will never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. I bet you've sung that before, haven't you? But there was Jeremiah thinking, I still remember, in spite of all that's happened, the mercy, the loving kindness, the grace of God. Well, there's a whole host of other passages to talk about that, but let me just, as we go back to justice, mercy, let me make one other point here that ought to, I think, mean a lot to us. If God were only just and were not merciful, what would that mean to you and me? I can tell you what it means. The soul that sinneth, it will die. Period. That's the justice of God. That's what I deserve. That's what you deserve. But the fact is, God's merciful and he's gracious. And what God wanted to do was maintain his justice, but also mercifully make possible to justify sinful Leonard White. And Paul speaks about that in Romans chapter 3. And Paul's point there, if you'll notice very carefully, there in Romans chapter 3, that Paul develops the idea that through his provision of Jesus Christ and his atoning death, God could be both just and the justifier. of them that have faith in Jesus. And so with this sense of this overwhelming kindness and mercy and loving kindness of God, now let's think about how the New Testament has so much to say about this. He's our perfect model in all of this. Let's consider how he expects us to emulate him. In many ways, of course, but as we're thinking this morning about his mercy. The New Testament has a lot to say about mercy. Probably, if I were to ask you, what story can you think of that Jesus told that pictures a man who showed mercy when you might not have expected him to? You'd probably say, well, that sounds like the Good Samaritan, doesn't it? And indeed it does. In Luke chapter 10, I'll not read the whole passage. I'm sure everybody here is fairly familiar with it. But here was a situation, a man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho. And robbers robbed him and beat him and left him for dead. Along comes a priest. Surely, here's a man who will show him mercy. He walks by on the other side. Along comes a Levite. Walks by on the other side. And along comes, and Jesus deliberately, I'm sure, makes this a Samaritan with all the feelings of animosity, the mutual animosity between Jews and Samaritans. The Samaritan saw the man and he felt compassion. You remember he went to him, he treated his wounds, put him on his beach, took him to the inn, paid the innkeeper to continue to take care of this man. If you think about that, the occasion that prompted that story was this lawyer. That would be not an attorney as we think of it, but a man who was an expert in the law of Moses. And questioning Jesus what he should do, and he told him to keep the law. And one of the things was to love your neighbors yourself. And his quibble was, who's my neighbor? And that's why Jesus told the story. But you know, when Jesus got through telling the story, he said, now, which of these three proved a neighbor? It seems the lawyer couldn't even bring himself to say the Samaritan. But what he does say exactly focuses upon what the story is about. He said, the one who showed mercy toward him. You remember what Jesus said? Go and do the same. You're going to do the same. James talks about the wisdom, the true wisdom, the wisdom that comes from above. James chapter 3. In verse 17 he says, this true wisdom, the wisdom from above, is full of mercy. We want to be wise people, and then we'll be people who are full of mercy. And I would say here, let me draw a parallel here. When Peter speaks about in 1 Peter 4:19 about hospitality, and he tells us to show hospitality without, King James says grudging, I think some versions say without complaint. Can you relate to that? When you show love for a stranger and you do whatever they need and you don't grumble and complain about it. But now notice what's said about mercy. Over in Romans, again, chapter 12 and verse 8, the Apostle Paul says, let him who shows mercy do so with cheerfulness. The time I think when mercy and kindness and long-suffering maybe is more challenging for us is kind of like Napoleon. You see somebody who you can say, they don't deserve it. The Samaritan could have said, I didn't put that man in that position. I don't owe him anything. But then when we do feel, maybe we're inclined to feel imposed upon and showing mercy, Paul said, you do that with cheerfulness. Be glad. Be glad that you are being like a merciful God when you do that. And do it with the right attitude. Well, I want to kind of bring these thoughts we talked about at this point together as we think about God's mercy and how we need God's mercy. And we are to be merciful people and showing mercy. Have you ever thought, as you join those two ideas together, what would be the consequence as far as my need for and desire for God's mercy if I'm not merciful? And there's several verses that touch upon that. The first one probably comes to most people's mind is in the Beatitudes. Everyone here can say that with me. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. But now let's notice how that can be amplified on. I think one of the most emotionally moving parables of Jesus is the parable that we usually call the parable of the unmerciful servant. Again, I'll not read it, but let me remind you basically of what that story is about. The story begins with a king who's calling his slaves in to check what their accounts are, what do they owe him. And the first man is brought before him as a slave who owes him 10,000 talents. And what a talent was, most think this was an Attic talent, which would be equivalent to about 6,000 denarii. Denarius was what a laborer would usually be paid in a day. So 6,000 days' wages was a talent. This man owed 10,000 talents. It's hard to relate monetary values with ancient times in mind, but just for round numbers, let's say he owed $60 million. Yeah, he could never. We're tempted sometimes to try to overinterpret parables, and sometimes people say, well, how can a man ever have a debt like that? Well, that's not important. Jesus isn't purposely describing the scene in such a way to impress upon us. Here was a debt he couldn't pay. It was an astronomical debt. And what did he do? Well, justice says you pay your debts or you pay the consequences. So that would be justice here. But this man, he fell to the ground. The Lord was first of all thinking, well, justice here, what we'll do is we'll just sell him, and we'll sell his family, we'll sell everything he owes. He can't even come close to paying it off, but we'll get what we can. And you remember then that slave fell to the ground, he prostrated himself before the king, and he said, have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. Well, they both knew he could never do that. But what he's saying, is he asking for mercy? Well, clearly he is. Have patience. Well, really what he's saying now is give me more time, and I'll do what I can. And even if this king had been willing to go beyond his justice to show some mercy, what he could have said is, okay, I'll give you some time. That's not what he said, was it? He just forgave the debt. He just mark it off the books. You don't owe it. Now, had the parable stopped there, I think that would have been a powerful lesson in mercy. I think it's clear when you get the whole parable together, this king is representing God, and here we have a debt that we can never pay. What were we taught by Jesus to pray? Forgive us our debts. We forgive our debtors. So I have a debt that I can never repay to God, and he graciously, mercifully made provisions I can be forgiven that debt. That's not where this parable stops. Now notice, this same man who had been forgiven this huge debt turns and he found a fellow slave who owed him 100 denarii, 100 days' wages. That's a sizable amount. And he seized him by the throat, Jesus says, and he choked him. He said, pay what you owe. Even at that point we think, how could he? As I said, every time I read this, it's almost like when Nathan told David the story about the man and the ewe lamb. You think, something's got to be done with that man. How could he be that way? And that's what the fellow slaves saw when they saw this. But the interesting thing is Jesus, again, the exact same words. This fellow slave fell to the ground. He pled with him. He said, have patience and I will repay you. And he was unwilling. He threw him in prison. They should pay what he owed. And as the fellow slaves observed that, they were moved as I hope you and I would be. Something. How could a man be that way? How could he forget? And they told the king, and the king called him in. And the king was moved with anger, and he said, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Now look for our word mercy. Should you not also have mercy on your fellow slave in the same way that I had mercy on you? And Jesus said he turned him over to the torturers, which is what he deserved. Well, what's the application of that to us? This is one of those cases where Jesus doesn't leave it for us to figure it out, because in verse 35 he says, my heavenly Father will also do the same to you. If I don't show mercy, then I'm like that slave who grabbed his fellow servant by the neck and choked him. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. A number of years ago, I was talking with a brother in Arkansas that I had a great deal of respect for. And somehow this discussion came upon this matter of mercy. And he said, you know, Leonard, I don't believe there's going to be any mercy shown on the day of judgment. Now, I think I know what he meant by that. I think what he was saying is we cannot spurn God's will and live any way we want to. And then on the day of judgment, I grew up listening to Brother Luther Blackman. I may mention him tomorrow too, but some of his little country expressions, if you ever knew Brother Blackman. And he would talk about people who would live as they want to and then throw the ashes of their misspent life in God's face. And if that's what this brother meant, I think I would agree with him, that we can't expect to ignore what God's provision by mercy has made for us now and then just throw ourselves on his mercy. However, as I thought about what that brother was saying, I thought there is a sense, I think, in which the Bible speaks about mercy and judgment. Let me read you a verse that I think says it very plainly. It's in James chapter 2 and verse 13. James says, judgment. The King James, I think, says without mercy. This verse says, judgment will be merciless to one who has shown no mercy. Very much like what we already saw. And then he goes on to say, mercy triumphs over judgment. Well, again, I think there will be a time, I'm quite certain, where you and I will want more than we've ever wanted anything else, to have the mercy of God. What we don't deserve. We often use the word grace to cover that, don't we? If you think about that attitude that we ought to have, do you realize, as we don't know, actually, from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what Jesus said, the Apostle Paul tells us in Acts 20, as he was talking to the Ephesian elders, that Jesus taught it's more blessed to give than to receive. You think about this, it seems to me, I had to study Elizabethan drama in college. I don't know why, but and so we were exposed to something about the Shakespeare. And it seemed to me Shakespeare knew a little bit about the Bible and some biblical principles. You probably heard this passage. It's from The Merchant of Venice, where Portia is pleading with Shylock for mercy. But here's that famous saying, the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as a gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. And now notice, and it is twice blessed. Twice blessed. And then Shakespeare says, it blesseth him who gives and him who takes. Makes it a little bit easier, I think, to show mercy with cheerfulness. To know that it is more blessed to give than receive, and particularly as we think about mercy. As I just said a moment ago, I'm confident someday I will want so much the mercy of God. There will be many things that will come into play there, but one of them will be, Leonard, did you show mercy? Were you merciful? What a wonderful text this is, Micah 6:8. What does God require of you? He requires of us justice. He also requires of us mercy or kindness. And I suspect we're going to hear a pretty good lesson in just a few moments.